Welcome to the Stepmom Side with Alicia Crasco, the podcast for stepmoms ready to create the life they want and one they actually have a say in. Here we talk all things stepmom life and just a little bit more. Leave the superficial conversations at the door and get ready for perspective shifts and actionable advice to help you on your way to creating the life you want, one step at a time. Hi, Tracey. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, how are you? I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. I'm super pumped to have you because obviously we talk a lot about divorce in a blended family situation. And I know my audience has like a lot of questions for you. Like, oh, can I just like sit and pick your brain for a little bit or like bend your ear and ask you all the questions about divorce? And I'm like, oh, you know what? I'm going to have somebody, we can ask her a few questions. So thank you for saying yes. Thanks for being here.
Absolutely. Yes, let's do it.
Because they might not know you. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'd love to. So my name is Tracey Coates. I am a family law attorney. I am licensed and practice in DC and Maryland. So I do all aspects of family law, so divorce, custody, child support. I also do prenups and postnups. Sort of what I like to call my happy area is adoption. So I do a lot of adoptions as well, which I love. And I also do estate planning. So I sort of run the gamut of all different family law areas. And I have been practicing now almost 20 years.
Wow. You cover like everything.
Yeah, I do. And I love it. The variety. I
Yeah.
really enjoy the variety in what I do. So that's really why I engage in different areas.
Okay. So my first question for you is the most basic, but what advice do you have for somebody before they enter into like a divorce or before they try even mediation? Like what should they be aware of? Because I feel like a lot of people go in just thinking like, oh, it's how bad could it be? We're just gonna get it.
Mhm.
And then
And then it goes south real fast, right? So I think the first thing that I would tell people to do is really understand what the laws are with respect to your set of circumstances. I think so often people come in, especially at least to me, and they're like, oh, well, my sister's cousin's brother, this is what they did in their divorce. So here's their agreement, and I want this. Right. And it's not applicable to them in any way, shape, or form. So I really always advise people to go in, and even if you decide not to hire an attorney, meet with them for like an hour. Let them tell you what the law is. Let them tell you how the law applies to your set of circumstances so that you can make informed decisions going forward. So I think that's like the number one thing that people need to start with. They need to understand what it is they're getting into.
do you see a difference like with not to generalize, but like males and females? I was talking to one of my stepmoms that's in my community yesterday about this on office hours, and she was like, yeah, I feel like guys like, hey, you know what? I'm getting a divorce. And the other guy's like, cool, we never liked her anyway. And then that's basically it. But then like women are like, hey, I'm getting a divorce. Can you tell me what you did? Kind of like my sister's brother's husband's uncle's getting a divorce, and here's what they did. Can you tell me what you did? And they kind of get like more information about it. Do you see that common for you?
You know what? I think actually it's sometimes, but I have a lot of male clients right now, and I gotta tell you, they're all dads. I'm just trying to run through it. They're all dads right now, and they're really invested in the process. It is not just one of those, oh, hey, okay, and then skirt right back. They're really devoted dads, which obviously doesn't always happen, both moms and dads, but I wouldn't necessarily say that my clients specifically are the ones that are males are just sort of not attached to the process. They really are invested in the process, as are my female clients as well. But it's really sort of runs the gamut. It's sort of a 50-50 split these days, which I love, right? I mean, I love to see, especially parents invested, involved, and really wanting to show up as their best self as a parent.
Yeah. And speaking of like parenting, so there's going to be a custody agreement, right? Or a parenting plan or what, depending on where you are, like what state you live in, what country you live in, what it's called. How do you talk them through like how to be prepared for like the longevity of how this is going to play out or
In
no?
terms of like custody and things like that, absolutely, because I think there are so many moving pieces with respect to custody. In most jurisdictions, obviously, I cannot provide legal advice to anybody who is not specifically my client. So this is all legal information. But I would say when I'm talking with clients with respect to custody, we have to consider legal custody, and at least in Maryland and DC, that's sort of the decision making aspect, right? So we have to talk about how that's going to work. Do you and your spouse communicate? Are you able to communicate about your children? And then there's physical custody, which I think a lot of people, that's what they relate to when they think about custody. Where are my children going to live? And then you break it down even further into academic years, into holidays, into, special occasions and all of that. And so we do really walk through every single piece of the process with respect to how that's going to look. Is that going to change every year? Vacations, of course, there's child support. How are things going to get paid? If your child has special needs, who is going to continue to fund that process? Where are the therapists going to be? All of that. So I think particularly when you have children, what I always tell people is this is the part that people are really, it's emotional. It takes the longest because the rest in terms of assets and property, that really is a business decision. That's about money. That's about dollars and cents. And it's not that it's not important. You have to have some place to live. You have to have resources. But when you're talking about your kids, that's a very deeply emotional process.
hmm So can you talk about the schedule changing? Because that's something that I see a lot. Some people will have like clients that I have are like 223 or 2252,
Mhm.
and that might work like when they're little, and then they're older now. And are you going to do it with a teenager? Like, can you talk about like, because you said, is it going to change by year? What does that look like? And how hard is it to go back and change that? Is it better to go through mediation? Is it better to meet with a lawyer again?
All really good questions. I would say typically one of the things that parents obviously are very concerned when they've been an intact family is now their children aren't living and spending time with them under the same roof, right? So that creates anxiety on both sides. But really, kids are so adaptable. And as long as they have a schedule and they know what the schedule is, obviously age appropriate, can't teach that to an infant, but when they understand what a schedule is, I think it's very important to be consistent and for them to know. A lot of my clients either have something, even like old fashioned, like something on a refrigerator, and days with mom, days with dad. And so I think that's really important to set forth in terms of a schedule. But in terms of alternating, particularly for our region of the world where I live, Maryland, DC, and Virginia. While I'm not licensed in Virginia, I actually live in Virginia, but I practice in Maryland and DC. But we're all so closely connected because I think when you're talking about schedules, it works sometimes if both parents live down the street from one another, and you can do the 225, the 223, or even a week on, week off schedule because kids can walk back and forth to each other's homes. But in this area, sometimes you could be 10 miles away in a different state. So
Mhm.
then you have to take into effect, all right, school, what time do kids have to be in school? Because 10 miles in DC could be, and I'll give you an example. I dropped my son off at school the other day. He attends school in Maryland. We live in Virginia. Long story, don't even ask. Takes like an hour to get him to school. I then had to be in court in DC. So from his school to DC Superior Court was 7 miles. It took me 45 minutes to get there. So when you're talking about schedules, I mean, you really have to know your surrounding areas. You have to be in tune with the realities of what your day to day is going to be like. Because even going, no, I want 50-50 no matter what. Well, is 50-50 really in your child's best interest? And if it is, let's figure out a schedule that works for them. And it can certainly change as they grow older. I mean, one of the things that, a sort of a running joke, if you will, with teenagers is they typically vote with their feet. You can pick up a 4-year-old and put them in the car and say, okay, let's go. Try telling I have a 14-year-old, try telling a 14-year-old, right, that he's got to be here and not for any bad reason in terms of I don't want to spend time with mom or dad. It's I would rather be on the basketball court or I've got practice. The schedules need to fluctuate and you need to sort of roll with the punches. I think schedules are great as a default. And I always tell my clients, let's have an agreement because you need a default. But the hope is that parents are going to get to a point where they can talk to one another, that tensions have sort of cooled after the divorce process, and they can work together to do what's best for their kids.
Yeah, I completely agree. So when I was telling you before, like my stepson moved in when my daughter was born, like just a few months later. And so he was 14 when he moved in, turned 15 and or 15 turned 16. And they're basically the same, only except the little one, like you can pick them up and like take them around, right? But they're like messy and have smells and like eat like crazy. And you know, he could drive, he could, he's a lot bigger than I am, but yeah, it's a lot harder to say you're going to do this, you're going to do that, and trying to like navigate that. Can you talk, since you talked a little bit about you have to take in your surroundings and like where like what is the best interest for your kids, can you talk about the custody agreement and like moving and living arrangements and how that can be affecting, like let's say, because you talked about you lived in Virginia but you practice in DC and Maryland, so let's say you've got somebody that lives like on one side of the state line versus the other, or typically written into divorce agreements, custody agreements, do you have like, okay, this parent can't move outside of the state or they can't move outside of this parameter?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you definitely need to be as detailed as possible when you have agreements, because of that very reason. People are so transient these days, especially near major cities, whether it's for a variety of reasons people move. So, for example, if a parent gets a job in a different state, you typically don't want that other parent just picking up and moving with the child, obviously, right? Because that cuts off access for that other parent. But also, you want to incentivize people to continue to do better in their lives, to continue to grow personally, right? And be successful. And so, you need to make sure that there is some sort of language in the agreement that spells that out. And typically, what a lot of agreements have is a mediation provision. If one party is going to move out of the state or the area and needs to modify the actual access schedule, it is usually easier to go back to a mediator before returning to court and filing things because it gets expensive. Then, feelings are hurt and it spirals out of control pretty quickly. So we like to put in those types of provisions that say, okay, if one parent is going to relocate, sometimes you can say, for example, for us outside of the DC metro area, which can include Maryland, DC, and Virginia, or if you're in a different state or jurisdiction, some people put in a mile radius. Um, because again, if you have kids, you don't want to wake up a kid at 4 a.m. to get them to school at 7, right? Because you live so far away now. That just doesn't make sense. So I really like the mediation provision. And then if you're not able to work things out, then you may have to go back and then file something and to have a court decide as to what that schedule looks like. But I will tell you, one of my very first cases years and years ago, we represented a dad in the DC area, and mom had picked up and moved to Minnesota with the child. And what the court ultimately said was, hey, I have no jurisdiction over you, right, mom? I can't tell you where to live, but I do have jurisdiction over your child. So if you would like to still be in your child's life, you should move back with your daughter because I'm ordering your daughter to come back. And I will switch custody because mom had primary if you don't come back. And while I think on some level that seems like, oh my gosh, I can't believe a judge could do that. But on the other level, if you have an involved parent and invested parents, you don't want to completely cut that parent off out of that child's life. And that's often what happens because somebody will just pick up and you're like, okay, well, now you got to figure it out. But ideally, both of you should be talking and figuring it out.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I guess that's you've gone through the court system, so to speak, right? I mean, literally.
Mhm.
And then you came up with this parenting plan, custody agreement, whatever it's called, wherever you live. Yeah,
Mhm.
wow. Yeah, I mean, obviously you saw my mouth drop like, wow, yeah, I can't tell you have jurisdiction over your kid. That is crazy. So speaking of
Yeah.
kids and like, you know, dictating, telling them what to do or where to go, can you talk about school districts? Let's say that in a blended family, mom says, okay, well, I want my son to go where his stepbrothers go, but his dad is like, no, I want him to go to a different school district. How do you navigate that?
That's a very tricky thing because it does turn into, who makes the final decision. And
Mhm.
in some jurisdictions, there's what's called tie-breaking authority with respect to legal custody. And that basically means that both parents have joint legal custody. And so they talk about what it is that should happen. And then sometimes the judge will award or somebody will agree that that one parent has the ability to make the final decision essentially in either all the areas or sometimes, as you just pointed out in an example, in the area of education. And that typically happens if, with some of my clients who are professors or who are teachers and they're like, oh, okay, or, with the health aspect, if I have clients that are doctors, that's typically where that plays out. But if it doesn't, and there is no tiebreaker, you're right, it can turn into a really contentious issue. And so, one thing, obviously, again, I always stress mediation because I think sometimes people don't realize is that they come in guns blazing and want to have their day in court. But realistically, a judge is only going to know what he or she has in front of them in your file. You hope that they have read it. You hope that they are going to obviously be thorough. And not to say that judges don't want to, but their dockets are very heavy. Their time is very limited. So it is always best, your family the best, for you all to figure out a way to work these things out. And just a side note, I always tell people that if you a really good agreement is one you both do not like, which means you both have had to give up something in order to get something in return. So that to me is I'm always trying to get people to settle if it's appropriate. Um, and with respect to schooling, for example, because it's not only just do I go to school district with my mom or my dad or, two moms or two dads, it's public versus private school sometimes and who's going to pay for it. And so I think, again, courts typically will look at the history of the family. Have they been in private school or have they been in the school district for most of their lives? Which school district or school is better, not just in ratings, but obviously for your children. Do they offer special services that maybe the school district doesn't offer? So I think a lot goes into it, but ultimately, you know this, you've got to come to a meeting of the minds. And sometimes hopefully you're able to do that. Sometimes you get a third party involved, and sometimes, a court has to make that decision, which I tend to not want courts to make that decision for the reasons I just shared.
Yeah, you know your family best, right? Like your court system doesn't. And
Yeah.
you touched on judges, their docket's really heavy. It depends. There's so many factors that go in, and oh my gosh, yeah, 100%. Can we talk about child support for a second? Because it's such a touchy subject. Um,
Yeah.
what, let's say that, okay, so I came in as no kids, and my husband was obviously already paying child support. I'll just use my example. Somebody else had asked, like, can you ask about this? And then we had a daughter, and a lot had changed for our situation. So it's not really applicable to ours. Like my stepdaughter graduated that year, then my stepson moved in. So our child support like totally changed. But let's say that you still have stepkids that go back and forth, and then you
Mhm.
add in an ours baby. Can you get that child support lowered? Does it factor in that you now have additional kids, or it doesn't matter at all? Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, no, I think what I hear you saying is so if you have your own children together in an intact family, but one of you or both of you is paying child support to somebody else, does that lower your child support if and when you start having your own kids? Is what I understand, or am I off?
Off a little bit. So I'm partnered with somebody that has kids from a previous relationship, already paying child support. Now we have a kid together. Can we get that
Mhm.
child support lowered because we've now added a kid because we need the finances here?
I see. I think it depends on the jurisdiction you're in because all different laws are vary from state to state. And so I think in some respects, yes, the child support calculations and the guidelines, there is a placeholder for paying support to another child. There's also, I mean, this is a different topic, but also alimony, spousal support too can be taken into consideration just generally. But I do think it really just depends because one has nothing to do with the other necessarily. And your child support is typically based on parents' gross monthly income, at least where I am, and the amount of overnight. So if that doesn't change, right, and there are still the same factors, just adding an additional child and expenses isn't necessarily going to change the child support level on another side. A court will take it into consideration, but with many other different factors as well. But I would not say it's a clear-cut line that if you have additional children, it will automatically lower your other spousal support. I mean,
Yeah.
excuse me, child support.
Yeah, that's where it gets touchy because I hear that from stepmoms. They're like, but we have kids together. And I'm like, I know it sucks. Like it's just, and can you touch on the spousal support too? Because I've got stepmoms that are like, we pay a ridiculous amount of spousal support on top of child support. Can you talk about the differences? What are they? What's factored in?
Yeah, so in terms of child support, again, just generally, those are the funds that are used to raise children. And I will tell you, any parent will tell you, the amount of child support that parents receive isn't going to cover all the expenses of raising a child. It just isn't, right? So there is money that needs to continue. Because I have clients all the time that say, well, I pay X, Y, and Z. Why is my spouse or ex-spouse asking me to pay for additional things? And the additional things could be things like camp,
Mhm.
work-related daycare costs, um, computers, like as your kids get older, they need laptops, driver's ed, SAT prep, like all the things that child support doesn't necessarily cover, or it doesn't meet the expectations. So that's really what child support is. And in a lot of jurisdictions, particularly the ones that I am licensed and practice in, you can't necessarily waive child support. Child support is not for the parents to waive, it is for the benefit of the child. So if a waiver is accepted, it usually is because the parent who is supposed to be paying child support is paying in excess of what that basic child support amount is. And a really easy example is, if your child support amount is $1,000 a month, but your child is going to private school and that costs you $3,500 a month. Typically, then courts will allow the waiver of the 1,000 because you're paying, three times that amount. Now, with respect to alimony, alimony is really for the benefit of the recipient in terms of getting up to speed and being independent and self-supporting. Alimony can be for a defined period of time. It can be for an indefinite period of time. And lots of factors go into that because if you've just been out of the workforce for a couple of years and you just need to either brush up on your skills or get another certificate or go back to school and you can get that done within say 5 years, then perhaps the judge or you will agree that child support is for that defined amount of time. Now, say you're older. I have clients that are getting divorced much later in life and they've been out of the workforce 20, 30 years. They're more likely to be a recipient of indefinite alimony because no matter what they do in this period of time, they are going to have the same lifestyle or become self-supporting as their other spouse. So it just, in some states have calculations for these, like guidelines that you can put in computer programs, and others do not.
Yeah, the spousal support and the alimony is another like obviously touchy topic. Like, what is happening?
Mhm.
Why do we have to pay for like all of the things, right? Can you talk about, since we're talking about the other house, can you talk a little bit about, can you, when you go to court, can you see in the other party like if they are acting crazy, or if you think that there seems to be some sort of mental health thing that's been undiagnosed, or can, this is something I see like get, I like, how do they not see that she's not a good mom, or how do they not see that, she's possibly, got insert whatever mental illness? How do they not, how does the court not see that? How does her lawyer not see that? Can you see
You know
that
that
going?
Yeah, I mean that's a very difficult area to sort of navigate for a variety of confidentiality reasons, but also because the parental rights are such a very high standard, and it's very hard to terminate parental rights because parents have the a trusted ability to parent their own children, right? So that is even why in some of my adoption matters and some of the issues that come to the surface that you just shared, addiction, mental health, a court is not going to automatically say, oh, that's the reason why we need to terminate parental rights. Because here's the thing, even if a parent has addiction issues, and I have had clients that have been, institutionalized and hospitalized for medical reasons, if that parent is taking steps to treat those issues, then a judge is not going to say, oh, you have these set of factors going on right now. I'm taking your kids from you, or I am not going to give you the same level of custody as I would give the other spouse if you are being responsible and taking care of them. And so I think, yes, if one of the factors generally is mental health and fitness of a parent, and if that's not being addressed or taken care of, a court can certainly consider that. You can certainly have a mental health evaluation done. You can also do custody evaluations, particularly private custody evaluations, which tend to be quite costly. They can be anywhere from $20,000, $30,000 for a private custody evaluation. But in those evaluations, both parents typically run through a set of mental health tests and evaluations, and that custody evaluator will use that to determine what he or she thinks is a good solution for custody for that parent. So it certainly can be addressed, and it's a factor that courts will consider in every case, I'm assuming, across the board. But it's a very hard thing. Another hard area is alienation. I hear this a lot from parents. That parent is alienating the children from me. What do we need to do? Alienation is a very hard concept to prove, because sometimes if you're dealing with teenagers or you're dealing with small kids, it may not be alienation. It could just be it's more fun at dad's house because I don't have the same set of rules that I have at mom's house, and vice versa, right? So it really just it's a very hard concept to prove, and so is mental health, depending upon the route you take in order to provide that evidence.
Yeah, I thank you and I like that you touched on the alienation part of it. I had a podcast about alienation, and it can be very, very hard to prove, right? And it's sometimes I see if one parent's not getting what they want, that's the very first thing they say, well, I'm being alienated. And do you see that? Like if somebody's not getting what they want, they are quick to say, oh, the other house is just doing this wrong, right? It just comes down to a conflict of interest, or not necessarily a conflict of interest, but like they just parent differently.
Yeah, I mean, and that's another thing that people need to know going into divorce and into separate homes. People parent differently. And you could even parent differently, obviously, in the same home, but it's not as noticeable if you're both under the same roof, you're an intact family, kids know, oh, I mean, my kids know I can get away with this with mom, but I can't get away with this with dad, or dad's gonna buy me this. Mom would never spend this kind of money on that, right? And it's just a different method of parenting, but it is certainly under a microscope, and it's highlighted when you are in two separate households, and you're parenting differently. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? I think that it gives boundaries, it gives structure, and if kids know, and I think every kid, no matter what, is going to try at some point, many times, play the other parent against each other. And that's why it's so important to have two parents who are able to sort of see past all that, communicate, talk. And you don't have to have the same rules in your home, but you do have to respect the other parent's household and the other parent so that they feel supported in the decisions that they're making. And if it's applicable, that you then too, if you support it, can apply it in your home as well. For example, like in terms of taking a cell phone. If one parent takes a cell phone, because this comes up a lot from one household, it may be appropriate to say, nope, you can't, you screwed up over here. I'm not going to reward bad behavior. I'm also going to implement the same rules that mom or dad has had. And that to me is co-parenting at its finest.
Yeah, we have definitely done that. And, I hear like, oh, well, I know at our house, like we're the strict house, but at that house, they don't do anything. And it just comes down to, like you said, like a difference in parenting. And there's a lot of like, well, you're a bad mom because you don't do what we do, or you're a bad dad because you don't do what we do. And it's sometimes parallel parenting is the best option for everyone involved, right? Like your
Absolutely.
rules, my house, my rules. Do you see after like a few years of divorce and maybe not keeping contact with your clients that like things kind of settle out and they are able to have a conversation or they're able to co-parent better?
I think both happen sometimes. I think it sometimes gets worse before it gets better, right? I have parents that come back and we need to modify certain things for a variety of reasons. But I think ultimately, after people are on the same page, and I will tell you that a lot of times part of the conflict is one party is ready to be divorced, the other party is not there yet. And so you're dealing with people who are at two totally points in difference in their lives, but the court, all it knows is to litigate and move everybody together in the same pace. And I think sometimes that contributes to the animosity and the tensions. But once people have sort of settled down, as you just indicated, it's been a couple of years, both have moved on in their lives, whether in new relationships or just changes in their lives, that they're both able to get past the initial hurt. I do think that parents are really able to co-parent and to do things really differently. And so I think that's great. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you talk about why would people modify the custody agreement? Like what are typically confusing?
Yeah, I mean, there are many different factors as to why somebody would want to modify. One of them we touched upon before, if people need to move, right? If I have a couple of clients right now, both want to move out of the area for work-related reasons or because they have family. They moved here when they were married and started to have kids, but they left their family behind. And now that marriage is broken down, they're ready to go back to wherever it is that they feel supported and they have their own sort of ecosystem. It could also be that one parent, unfortunately, has developed or has addiction issues that are no longer being treated or have surfaced. And so it doesn't make sense for that child to be in that person's care as much as it previously thought. It could be, I have another a situation relatively recent that um, they have a 50-50 custody schedule, but it really only works on paper. One parent wasn't as invested in the 50-50, and a lot of jurisdictions custody and child support are interrelated. So if you have more time with your kids, typically you pay less than child support. And so once that starts to unravel and you're no longer under the microscope of a child of the court, and your desire to spend that amount of time with your children wasn't sincere, the other parent will sometimes come back and say, look, I've got these kids almost all the time and my expenses are through the roof. I now need sometimes child support or I need more child support and I need this change so that on paper in a court order, it doesn't look like I'm violating, the court order or my agreement because I had the kids when the other parent's supposed to have them. So it could be a variety of different reasons that people come back in, but those are typically a lot of the ones that I see.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting why like people change divorce agreements or child agreements. Can you tell us the difference between a prenup and a postnup?
Yeah, actually, one, it's very simple. One, you enter into a prenup before you get married, and the other, a postnup, you enter into after you get married. And they have the same provisions, the same paragraphs, the same language. It's just when you enter into one. And I have had clients where we started in the prenup phase and it didn't get done, but it was very important for these parties to have a prenuptial agreement, and so we ended up entering into the agreement after they got married, and now it became a postnup. And you can certainly amend both at a later time if things change, and that does happen occasionally. But that really is the basics of the difference. It's not necessarily what goes into them; it's the time that you're entering into them.
Wow, interesting. What do you see, like, what are the reasons why people come in like after they've been married to get them? Do you think they come in like, okay, at some point we're going to get divorced? Do you think they come in thinking that? Or do you think they're just like, I want to
You
be
know, maybe. I mean, you know what I mean? It depends on when they come in too. Sometimes people see the writing on the wall and they think, you know what? I don't know if this is going to work out, and I probably should have gotten a prenup. And now I think, oh, I didn't want to sort of ruffle the feathers. I wanted to have the wedding. I didn't want to anger anybody. So now I'm ready to do it. And that sometimes is a very real, and I have had clients that come in and they're like, yeah, I'm not so sure. I want to protect my assets. Other times people come in afterwards because family pressure, and this is a big one. Family pressure is sometimes, particularly when you're dealing with younger clients, and mom and dad are saying, hey, we've got, particularly if they've got assets and they've got, trust, and they've got things that they want to pass on for a variety of reasons, they want to make sure their kids are not then just free for all in terms of what their assets are going to be divided later down in the event of a divorce. And so parents are pushing for their kids to get a prenup, either or a postnup, depending on when it is. Um, but with respect to postnups, I think sometimes people just change their minds and they just decide, you know what, I've got enough assets. I know a little bit about more about the law, or they didn't consult with anybody first, right? So they didn't know what they didn't know, and now it's time to enter into something.
Do you think that people should either have a prenup or a postnup, like most people or everyone?
Most people should, but it just depends. And I will say that, but I mean, I don't have a prenup. When my husband and I got married, we had nothing. So nothing together, right? Or very little, not nothing, but very little. And so it wasn't as much of a concern. But I will tell you, particularly in this day and age, women, especially, are waiting later to get married, and they are accumulating more assets. Some are entrepreneurs, they have businesses, they have a lot of stuff that they need to protect, and obviously men as well. But I am seeing a lot more women sort of delay that process. And so I do think it's very, very important to have those assets that you've accumulated protected and language surrounding them, because you never know. I mean, the hope of a prenup is to draft it, make it very tight, make it very concise, throw it in a drawer, and never think about it again.
Yeah, it's not supposed to be contentious, right?
Right, right. And exactly. And it can sometimes derail wedding dates. I have seen that, unfortunately, but it's not supposed to, right? But it's difficult because you're thinking about, you're in this great happy place, you're in love, you're happy getting married, yet you're thinking about the end if this doesn't work out. So the sort of the two of those things juxtaposed with one another does make for some interesting conversation.
Oh my gosh, I can only imagine. We did will and estate planning years ago, and I was like, this will be fine. Like I'm more of like a logical thinker. And then I was thinking about like what if something really to happen to my husband? And I was like, and he's like, I'm not dead. Like I'm still here. Like, I know, but what if something happens? He's like, get over.
Your wheels start turning.
Yeah, so, but I can only imagine like, oh, you're wedding planning and wait, what if we get divorced, right? Wait, is it like planting a seed that I'm going to water? No, hopefully not, right?
Right, exactly.
You so much for all of your information. I think that you've answered a lot of questions, and maybe not in the way that stepmoms want to hear, but it's literally the law. Like there's not a lot of things that you can change when it comes to like specifically like can we lower the child support if we have an ours baby, right? And it can be taken into consideration, but it's not necessarily going to lower it. Um, or like can lawyers and judges see like an undiagnosed situation? Not necessarily. You guys are human too. And it's not necessarily something that you're trained in either. But yeah, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. Where can everyone find you?
Absolutely. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much. People can find me on my website at coatesfamilylaw.com. And again, I'm licensed in Maryland and DC. So if you have issues in those jurisdictions, please reach out. I'd love to chat with you.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this week's episode. If anything was helpful or resonated with you, please share it on social media and tag me. I'm just at Alicia Crosco. And if you could leave a 5-star rating and a review while you're at it, that would also be really helpful. And if you find yourself struggling with your stepmom journey and you want a little bit more support without the hefty price tag of coaching, you might want to check out the Stepmom Side community, which is my own private community for stepmoms, where you get to connect with other stepmoms around the world, and myself, where I hold weekly office hours and monthly group coaching. It's kind of like you have your own personal coach in your own back pocket. Again, without that hefty price tag. See you next week.